Hello, welcome. On behalf of the board of the Living Art Museum, I'd like to welcome you here today. We've shut down the videos and sounds of the current overview exhibition of Icelandic artist Bjarni H. Þórarinsson during our talks, and we will put them on again after the discussion for those interested in seeing the show. The show is actually curated by Jón Proppe, our moderator of today. Please let me know if the sound is not good or if you have questions, of course. I will pick up the ball straight in the 1970s and talk about the Living Art Museum. Many of the Icelandic guests today know the history of the museum quite well, and many played an important role in creating it. It would be great to have your inputs and about artist-run spaces, alternative spaces, and the term alternative after our talks. Just gonna put on the PowerPoint. There's no remote control, so it's going to be a little bit of switching. Well, the Living Art Museum is the longest running artist-run exhibition space in Iceland. It was founded by a group of over 20 artists in 1978 and was the first non-profit artist-run organization, you could say. The Association of the Living Art Museum was founded at the same occasion, today with a membership of 281 people, mostly Icelandic visual artists, as well as international ones. Since a few years ago, there's an open membership, and one can become a member of the museum through our webpage. There we have the window of the webpage where you can become members. The founders of the museum was born at the time of crisis in the artist community, where the work of young artists, such as new media works, installations, and artist books, were received with either indifference or disapproval of the National Gallery, which was the only art museum collecting art in Iceland at the time. The consensus was for change and to oppose the reigning policy of the museum. The founders of this museum were a diverse group of artists at various stages in their careers. Some had been members of the Zoom group. Others had been involved with Gallery Suðurgata 7, and yet others were still in art school. The museum's 1978 charter declares the following goals: to save from destruction, catalogue, preserve, and publicize works of art by national and foreign artists, to acquire documents on exhibitions in Iceland and abroad with as complete information in written or pictorial form as possible, to acquire books, newspapers, and periodicals, and all kinds of documentation concerning art and artists, to serve as a center for the newest currents and experiments in Icelandic art, to initiate public discussion and publicize new trends in art as well as neglected periods of art history. The museum is, in other words, initiated by artists to preserve their own history and to make history, to activate and to make visible the self-empowerment of artists. The charter as well mentions that the 5-member board of the museum is elected for a short period of time, the chairman for 1 year and other board members for 2 years. The idea of implementing this constant change was to resist hierarchy and stagnation. Realizing that by working on a voluntary basis, as board members have done for the longest part in the history of the museum, tends to wear you out in a couple of years' time. It ensured renewal and a continuation. The rapid changes also have their disadvantages, a certain loss of knowledge within the museum, which comes from experience and know-how, not planning much ahead, which can be expensive, and an active interest in attending to the making of history and much, perhaps less interest in preserving it. The museum's collection is one of the most complete collections extant in Iceland of artworks from the 1950s through the 1990s by Icelandic and international artists, and also has a goodly number of works from the last 10 years. The collection is unusual in that all the works have been donated, either by members or artists exhibiting at the museum. NYLO's founding collection is comprised of gifts from artists Ragnar Kjartansson Sr. And Niels Hafstein, as well as works retrieved from the Zoom group's storage space. And the oldest works are from 1952 by Swiss-German artist Dieter Roth, who lived in Iceland for quite many years. Among 300 works of his, including about 100 bookworks. The inaugural meeting moved to include a clause in the charter requiring members to contribute 2 of their own works upon entering the association of the museum, and thereafter to make an annual donation of 1 artwork or original source material on an artwork. This insertion of this clause guaranteed the growth of the collection. Systematic acquisitions in the museum's early years gradually diminished due to a lack of storage space. The museum had as well acquired works that were left in the space after exhibitions. Works that had piled up in inadequate storage for most of the time and without the conservation work required to preserve and properly catalogue them. Still, many members made big efforts in keeping the work safe and secure as possible along the way. At the 1990 annual meeting, the clause was revised to require members to donate artworks at 5-year intervals. There has been very little collecting in the last 10 years due to scarce storage capacity. But since relocating to this current space, the museum is able to actively collect again. The museum was founded as a non-political artist institution, but with an engagement in issues concerning society and cultural politics. The main purpose of founding a new contemporary art museum in Reykjavík at the time was to establish and to introduce contemporary art within the local cultural scene. I'll just show you a few random images from different exhibitions throughout the years. I think I'll have to push and talk and chew gum. And the museum has, over the last 32 years, offered a varied program that has extended beyond art exhibitions, including over 1,000 shows, performances, film and video screenings, live music events, lectures, and symposiums. Since its foundation, the Living Art Museum has been an important forum in the Icelandic art community for introducing, reflecting, and debating the role of contemporary art. The museum is and has been operated on a shoestring budget, which at first came largely from membership fees and rent from exhibitors. Today, it receives funding from the city of Reykjavík, the state, and the Museum Council of Iceland. And I hope to maybe come back to that in our discussions, sort of funding issues. The museum has, from the start, been the main platform for bringing artists from elsewhere to Reykjavík. And earlier on, it directly opened up possibilities for Icelandic artists to exhibit abroad, giving introduction to currents and influences from abroad that were underrepresented in the larger art museums until just over a decade ago. I'm going a little ahead here. The political angle of the Living Art Museum does not lie in its program of exhibitions as it lies in the stance its boards have taken for the institution, initially being formed as an alternative indeed, and an activity that challenged the cultural climate at the time and further inspired the self-empowering of local artists. The initiation of the museum is one of the more important steps taken by Icelandic artists in the establishing of their own subhistory. In 2008, the museum celebrated its 30th anniversary with a program constructed to reflect, reconsider, and self-critically reinvent its history, with the aim of shaping its vision for the future. The museum board at the time slowed down the public activity and initiated a thorough registration of the art collection and archives of the museum, with the thought of reclaiming our own art history to be able also to move ahead. In the process, works were gathered that have been kept in storage spaces all over the city, and many of them had not been exposed or even examined for some time. Before the registration process started, the previously registered works of the collection were counted up to about 750 works. Now, 2 years later, it is apparent that the collection holds about 2,000 works by Icelandic and international artists. So this has been an important contemporary archaeology, really. The registration data has now been transferred to a digital database for further accessibility to the public. During this period, in the previous space of the museum, artists were invited to intervene, to do interventions that reflected on this activity, the publicly open museum space as a storage space. A living art museum, but perhaps faced with the question of becoming the living dead museum. This image is from the remaking of the museum's image, self-presentation and interface, from an exhibition of artists Runo Lagamorsino, Ylva Westerlund and Olivia Plender in 2008. Here in the current space of the museum, which we opened to the public in February this year, the museum board made a conscious decision to keep an open office, an open and inviting kitchen/social space, an open working space for research projects, transparency and visibility of ongoing archives. The arrangement in the space is meant to make visible to guests of the museum the work that takes place in an art museum. We don't consider it to be a side activity, but equal in importance as any other activity of the museum, be it exhibitions or something else. This decision is informed by the internal activity of the last 2 years, which left the previous board of the museum with little alternative than to transform the previous museum space into a registration factory of sorts. Each board of the museum greatly influences the direction its history takes. The current board has taken on the interesting challenge of creating a transition between preserving history and creating future history, a kind of a back to the future situation. As for the public program and general direction, the current board of the museum has been standing on crossroads this year after a massive U-turn as a result of the registration process. We've taken that process as our point of departure in this new space, with a priority in finding a way to build something new on the ground of our history, finding balance between the added responsibility of the fully grown-up institution and the living element of the Living Art Museum. One part of this attempt is our initiative this year and the next following year to invite a few curators from the Nordic-Baltic region for collaboration, to reflect upon the idea, role and possibilities of this institution, its historical locality and element of self-empowerment. Each curator is invited to realize a project through using the museum's collection and archive as a research platform. The artist-run spaces, run by two of these collaborators, were actually mentioned earlier. One of them is Kim Einarsson, who directs Konsthall in Stockholm, which Maria Lind mentioned yesterday. And another is Elena Tsotsi, who together with two artists runs Signal Gallery in Malmö, which was mentioned as well. During the period of registration at the museum in the last couple of years, two ongoing archives were established. An archive of performance in Iceland, which Markus mentioned earlier today in his talk, and an archive of artist-run spaces in Iceland, and actually of artist-run spaces run by Icelanders abroad. And these you can see in boxes behind the structure in the space. And I will tell you briefly about the archive of artist-run spaces. The history of artist-run spaces in Iceland is largely unwritten, although it sums up quite an important and informative part of the local art history. As the Living Art Museum is the oldest active artist-run space in Iceland, the previous and current boards find it highly important to collect, register, and mediate this history. We based the archive on documentation from 4 spaces since the 70s, and we started to strategically locate as many spaces as possible. This year, one of our board members has been gathering and registering documentation from a number of artists who had been running the spaces for longer or shorter periods of time. The process includes recording interviews with artists, visiting their storage spaces and studios, searching in libraries, etc. The material includes texts, images, and artifacts that are informative of the spaces in question, its objectives, and activity. It depends then on the artist if they donate original material or copies to the museum. There are spaces, including these are spaces where the form is most important. For example, an exhibition space in a shoebox, in a suitcase, and so on. Then there are the ones which are venues, some of which change places with each exhibition. Then there are ones that are commercial platforms for selling art, and ones that focus on an agenda, such as female galleries or certain mediums, etc. We've now traced information on over 100 artist-run spaces in Iceland, run by groups and individual artists since the mid-60s, out of which 86 of them have been active in Reykjavík, and we keep counting. This great amount on a local scale gives us an even bigger reason to gather and mediate this history. This is our sub-history, our veins of the local art scene. I would like to mention in this regard that the first comprehensive book on the history of visual art in Iceland is yet to be published. It will be published next year as a comment on the sort of literal writing of history. Today, there are about 12 artist-run spaces active in Iceland, which you can have access to information about on the website of the Center for Icelandic Art and in their brochure published by the center. After the discussion today, we are all welcome to visit one of the longer-running artist-run spaces active today, the Kling and Bang Gallery, which is very close to here. Kling and Bang was initiated in 2003 by 10 artists and is currently run by 7 artists. And most of them will probably be there to tell you more about it. But to reflect a little bit and then further on in our discussion on the question of what is the alternative? Alternative to what? I've now traced sort of, you could say, the history of alternative art spaces so far. But after yesterday's session, when bringing up the term alternative, the title of our Nordic Samarbeiði platform, And through the preparation of this weekend, really, I'm strongly intrigued by the manifold understandings in our conversations, as was the intention of the usage of the very term. An alternative has to be an alternative to something, an opposition to conventions. What then is an alternative when conventional institutions become unconventional? In terms of the arts in Iceland, I think there has been a shift of the conventional. The city and state art museums, and to a certain extent the suburban Hafnarhúsi Art Center and Gerðarsafn Art Museum, are in the past few years functioning a bit like as kunsthalles, with different local and international exhibitions and active event programs, including discussion like the one we're having this weekend. Recently, artist-run spaces such as the I8 Gallery, Gallery August, Klingenbank Gallery, Skaftfell Art Space in the east of Iceland, and the Living Art Museum have recently presented exhibitions presenting small researches on specific parts of the local sub-art history. To me, these reflect the importance many artists find of attending to the role of art historical research. Perhaps the conventional is actually the new alternative here in the Icelandic art context. In the case of Iceland, I see it as a complete subversion of how the situation used to be only a few years ago. The response of the local art scene to drastic changes of society in the past couple of years is not actually to create independent platforms for art. There are, well, arguably, but I think considerably fewer artist-run spaces in Iceland, in Reykjavík today, than there often have been, and only 2 of them have opened in the last 2 years. The tendency seems rather to be to revisit and preserve. The Living Art Museum was, as a contradiction, initiated as an institution by powers against institutionalism. To a certain extent, the book Listasafni, The Living Art Museum, 1978 to 2008, an overview of its activity, which was published by the museum earlier this year, is a grounded manifestation of the institution as an institution. Therein lies the interesting question of the alternative for me in regards to this particular institution. As in very different art political climate of today, this museum is no longer in an opposing situation. In fact, this very summer, the museum was presented with the biennial Museum Prize of Iceland, given by the Icelandic Museum Council at the President's House. This is all of us at that happy moment. I think I will conclude by saying that the Living Art Museum is once again at crossroads in terms of the concept of the alternative and as to the road its members and future boards wanted to take. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.